a young boy was playing an online RPG and strategy game on his computer. Even while he was hospitalized, out of nowhere, his body felt heavy and everything went black. His mind was swept away, sinking to the depths of an imaginary ocean, until suddenly, he woke up in a forest filled with cool air and overcast skies. Seated on a stone throne, to top it off, a woman stepped forward, addressing him as if she'd been waiting for him to wake up. As she emerged from the shadows, the boy immediately recognized her. It was none other than Atu, an elf who called him king. The game he'd been playing while bedridden was a dark fantasy 4X strategy simulator called Eternal Nations, and the character he loved most, the one standing before him now, was this very elf. Now, he couldn't help but wonder, should he act like the king she claimed he was? It was clear she saw him as the leader of Minagra. Sensing his confusion, the girl smiled and said, "It's all right, Takuto." After all, he'd beaten Nightmare difficulty using what was considered the hardest civilization in the game, the ruined civilization, Minagra. Because of that, Era Takuto became the legendary player at the very top of the global leaderboard. Atu, for her part, remembered every moment they'd played together, how they had conquered the world side by side time and again, so there was no need for him to worry. She knew exactly who he was. Thinking back, Takuto realized Atu matched his own playstyle. Maybe because he'd always wanted to be as strong as she was. Tears welled up in his eyes as he admitted how happy he was to finally speak to his favorite character. She said she felt the same. Takuto asked if this was heaven, and if Atu was the one who'd brought him here. But she explained that she, too, had simply appeared in this place out of the blue, and it didn't seem much like paradise. If anything, she thought, it felt more like the world of Eternal Nations. No doubt about it, she said, it was a miracle, and it was a true honor to meet her master in person. With that, the elf knelt before the boy, took his hand, and invited him to start again, just the two of them, building a kingdom of their own. As tempting as the offer was, Takuto was still lost in confusion. Even so, with his loyal companion by his side, maybe this was his chance to relive those golden days in this new world. So, Takuto called on his servant to begin their journey together. Atu introduced herself as the child born from the mud who would bring destruction to the world, declaring that, from now on, her body and mind belonged solely to her master. Hearing this over-the-top speech, Takuto cringed with secondhand embarrassment. He realized how much harder it was to say such things in real life than it was in the game, and Atu admitted it was a little embarrassing for her too. Still, the king decided to play along, calling the elf his first and only subordinate, his confidant and right hand. Their civilization, infamous for being ruthless, but also meticulous and highly skilled in internal affairs. Then Takuto asked if his servant knew what Minagra's first move should be, and, in perfect sync, the two replied, "Let's go into hiding." Next, Takuto summoned a scout using emergency production. Without delay, a creature known as a long-legged insect crawled out of a portal, a sight both Takuto and Atu found a bit gross, if they were being honest. Still, Takuto reminded himself that Minagra was a civilization of moderation that wielded evil and ruin, so they'd need to keep that in mind as they acted. For Atu, that meant they had to do everything possible to avoid revealing their true identities. First things first, the king ordered the insect to scout the area without being seen. Watching the insect scuttle off, Takuto realized he could see through its eyes. Summoning that scout had cost him 100 mana, leaving him with 100 more. Setting up a settlement, a base of operations, would take another 20. Atu pointed out that emergency production was expensive, so they should be careful with their spending. Takuto admitted he really wanted to create a warrior to defend them, but that would probably drain all his mana. Speaking of combat, the elf pledged to do her best, or, at least, that's what she wanted to say, if she weren't so weak right now. Takuto understood. Atu was a hero unit who got stronger over time, but at the moment her strength was only 3 less than even some basic enemies. In short, their entire plan to build Minagra was at serious risk if they were attacked by pretty much anything. Using the scout's vision, Takuto surveyed the land around them forest, as far as the eye could see. So far, there were no monsters in sight. Atu thought the forest was a perfect place to hide, but she found it strange that the long-legged insect hadn't spotted a single animal along the way. Even worse, Takuto realized there was nothing at all to eat. All they could do was stay alert and hope something turned up. Atu apologized for not being more helpful, but the boy told her that just having her company was more than enough, making her eyes shine with joy. Seeing her so moved, he thought to himself how hard it had been to notice these little things in the game. But Atu Lamacenta's personality really was just like this. Putting that aside, through the scout's eyes, Era Takudo soon discovered a community of dark elves not far away. Takudo explained that this type of elf tended to be neutral, maybe leaning a bit toward evil, which, honestly, was a relief. At the very least, it confirmed that they really were in the world of eternal nations. On the downside, if there was another civilization settlement nearby, it could spell trouble. Avoiding war at the start of the game was crucial. So, their top priority was to find a safe place to settle, but before that, they needed to keep an eye on the Dark Elves and gather more information about the area. If things went south, they'd just have to make a run for it. Suddenly, speak of the devil, a small group of dark elves appeared before the stone throne where Minagra's two companions sat. Earlier that day, the same group was making its way through the forest. One elf turned to Gia, their leader, and said they should just leave the cursed lands. There was no point in leaving the woods now. But Gia reminded them that they had already been exiled from their homeland, they had nowhere else to go. And honestly, their children wouldn't survive much longer under these conditions. Considering how lush the place was, there had to be food somewhere. A female elf pointed out that at the edge of the unexplored territory of Idaragia, there stood the vast, accursed forest, the cursed lands. All the books said something evil had been sealed there. Whatever it was, it would never allow life to flourish. Gia brushed this off, telling Emily that it was just superstition. The trees were clearly growing just fine. With that, the leader insisted no one could give up now, not at such a critical moment, and reminded them that their proud spirits and the ghosts of their ancestors would surely guide them through this hardship. Still, after these motivating words, Gia couldn't deny that the forest was truly frightening. But curse or not, that wasn't an excuse to leave. His people still had hope. As long as they had the strength, finding food was the priority. And that's how the band of dark elves found Minagra's two founders seated on the stone throne. To them, Era Takudo was nothing more than a shadowy, sinister figure, a vision so terrifying it made Gia break out in a cold sweat. Convinced he was witnessing evil incarnate, knowing his actions could decide the fate of his entire race, Gia gathered himself and stepped forward. Bowing before the figure on the throne, he introduced his companions as members of the Mazaram clan. His own name was Gia Najiv, the leader of their warriors, and he apologized for entering the forest without permission from what appeared to be the land's master. With a chilling expression, Atu Lamacenta recognized that this dark fairy truly understood the gravity of trespassing here, but wanted to know the reason behind it. Gia explained that their clan once lived in Idaragia, but they'd been persecuted and forced to flee into the forest. He tried to tell their whole story, but Atu pressed him to keep it brief, making Gia more and more anxious, not wanting to make a mistake that would put his people at risk. Amidst this, Takudo commented on how thin the dark elves looked, and Gia admitted, with a heavy heart, that they hadn't found any food in this place so far. Honest about his feelings, the dark elf wondered why his clan had to endure so much suffering, when all they wanted was a peaceful place to live. Out of nowhere, the supposed master of the shadowy forest offered him a handful of apples. Takudo mentioned that these taste delicious if you cut them into the shape of a rabbit. Gia had never seen fruit like this before, and wondered if it would be rude to try one on the spot. But the rest of his group was too hungry for such concerns. They bit into the apples, smiles spreading across their faces as the sweet, juicy flavor hit them. But that wasn't all. Takudo opened a portal and handed out pears as well. Gia bowed even lower, saying there were others like them who'd also escaped into these lands, including small, starving children. So, instead of eating now, Gia asked for permission to take the fruit back to the others. Takudo listened, felt sorry for them, and handed over even more food, this time with bread, vegetables, and greens too. Witnessing what seemed like a miracle, Gia Najiv reflected on how the dark elves had always been despised as outcasts from the light, barely tolerated thanks only to the mercy of the so-called fairies of light. Marked by scorn, Gia's people were forced to live in the shadows, and no one had ever reached out to help them in their darkest moments. Overwhelmed by such power and mercy, Najiv of the Mazaram clan finally dared to ask, who was this individual sitting on the throne? Meanwhile, back at the Dark Elf settlement, those who hadn't traveled were doing their best to bear the hunger that haunted the community. Then, suddenly, the foraging party returned, their leader grinning from ear to ear with the best news anyone could hope for. The famine was finally over. With all that food, joy swept through the whole village, and Gia watched the scene, deeply satisfied. When asked how he'd managed to find so much, he simply answered that he stumbled upon it, all while the ominous figure of Era Takudo lingered in his mind. Later that night, while the community slept, Najiv sat by a campfire, The old elder Molter came over to compliment the chief on his work. Molter said he'd lived a long life, but never, in all those years, had he seen such strange and delicious fruit. Najeeb agreed he'd never even heard of food like this either, and that was exactly why the old man wanted to know what had led the Mazaram clan to such unusual circumstances. Ready to share the truth, Jia said he'd met a legendary being deep in the forest. According to Imlay, there was a legend about a being sealed away in the cursed lands. Molter was stunned, wondering if the expedition party had encountered the Ruin King, a figure found, at least in part, in old books and stories. When the world reached its limit, the Ruin King would appear, bringing devastation to all, forcing people to start over from zero. As much as no one could say for sure if this would ever come to pass, it was also impossible to say the legend was just a lie. Jia, for his part, never caught the being's name, but he had to admit that frightening appearance fit the title of Ruin King all too well. The entity was simply beyond comprehension, but at least he had a servant who could clarify his words to some extent. Whatever the case may be, even if there's no certainty whether this entity is truly the King of Ruin, Molter senses that it's nothing good. Now that his stomach and a bit of his mana are replenished, the elder can feel it clearly. This forest is far from normal. He wonders if Jia might have given something to the entity in exchange for the food, but the chief insists that isn't the case. Molter doesn't buy it. He argues that the King of Ruin would never do a good deed without expecting something in return, but Jia swears there was no price at all, no strings attached. According to him, it genuinely seemed to be an act of mercy from that spirit. His Grace, as Jia calls him, saw the dire situation the Dark Elves were in and showed them compassion. Hearing this, Elder Molter is infuriated that Jia would refer to the King of Ruin as His Grace and starts to suspect that the leader of Mazaram must have fallen under the entity's spell. That's when an argument breaks out between these two pillars of the community. Jia insists that they owe the utmost respect to someone who fed their people when they were on the brink of starvation. In fact, he turns the question back on the elder, asking what he would have done in the presence of the King of Ruin. But even Molter can't come up with an answer to that, so he apologizes for his outburst to the bravest warrior of their tribe. From here on out, he declares, as the head of the Mazaram Dark Elves, he'll personally handle matters with the King of Ruin. After all, Molter has lived for 2 centuries, he's sure he can figure something out. In the end, all these two leaders want is for their people to find peace again. Meanwhile, back with Minagra's so-called founders, Atu scolds her master for blowing through a bunch of mana to feed the Dark Elves, reminding him that they need to start building their own nation, and that means conserving magic. Takudo, a little sheepish despite his charitable act, admits that he needs his companion now more than ever. Hearing this, Atu drops her tough act and slips into a weirdly love-struck, submissive mode, as if a single kind word from her master is enough to make her melt completely. Takudo, meanwhile, laments that he just couldn't manage to communicate properly with the Dark Elves. No matter how hard he tried, the words just wouldn't come out. Atu confesses she thought he was just trying to act like a mysterious mastermind who hates long speeches and lets his subordinates handle the details. But the truth is, the kid genuinely isn't much of a communicator. Honestly, he never was in his previous life, and it's not like he was suddenly going to become a master of rhetoric and charisma overnight. The next day, Elder Molter asks the young leader if he's ready to return to the place where the King of Ruin awaits. Once the young elf agrees, the experienced elder grows concerned about what that entity might want in exchange for helping their people. Even though Najeeb insists she never mentioned any kind of payment, the old elf knows all too well. Evil beings always expect some sort of reward. Regardless, he understands the Dark Elves need the king's help to survive. Jia agrees, pointing out that even if they left the forest in search of food, they might still return empty-handed. Speaking of leaving the forest, Molter reminds them that one of their hopes is for the clan to reach the Dark Continent and find a kingdom where they won't be hunted. Maybe that's their last chance. With that said, both leaders agree on one thing: the fate of their people rests in their hands. Meanwhile, the insect serving Takudo was listening to every word of their conversation. The scout quickly returns to his master to report that the Dark Elves would be arriving soon. Atu already suspected the elves wouldn't be able to carry all the food they'd received in a single trip. Takudo, on his part, points out that having people with different cultures and technologies nearby could easily lead to conflict. In fact, he'd prefer if they just took the rest of the food and left as soon as possible. The truth is, he worries he won't be able to negotiate with the elves because of his communication problem, which could cause misunderstandings down the line. Seeing this, Atu offers to handle negotiations on her master's behalf. which would also serve to elevate the king's grandeur. As night falls, Gia Najib arrives before the King of Ruin, accompanied by the tribe's elder, who introduces himself as Molter Cordal Mazaram, leader of the Dark Elves. Before anything else, Molter expresses his gratitude for the king's generosity in providing food to his people, then asks for the honor of learning his great name. Cautiously, Atu looks at the king, who gives a nod of approval. Taking the cue, she introduces him as Era Takudo, Lord of the Apocalypse, Sovereign of Ruin, and demands he be addressed as formally as possible, leaving Najib visibly impressed. Atu also introduces herself, and Molter vows to engrave both their names into the very soul of his people. Quietly observing, Takudo thinks everything is going smoothly so far, and Atu tells the elves they can take their food and leave. Molter then asks how he might repay the King of Ruin for his aid, but the elf woman immediately waves it off, insisting they could never possibly offer anything worthy of the king's greatness. Besides, since the Mazaram clan has nothing valuable enough to match such generosity, Atu interprets this as a suspicious attitude, which makes the exchange tense. She questions whether the elves are planning something behind this empty talk. Sensing the tension in the air, Takudo whispers a few things into his servant's ear. She snaps, grumbling that these elves are terrible negotiators and that if they don't leave the king alone, they'll only cause trouble and so should be annihilated. Raising her voice, Atu declares their heads would look perfect mounted on pillars. Takudo, meanwhile, urges everyone to calm down, guessing the Mazaram just want to build a relationship that benefits everyone. So maybe it's best to accept some form of compensation just to set their minds at ease. With that, Atu turns to the Dark Elves and announces the king is willing to accept a token of gratitude for his charity. As relief washes over the Mazaram's faces, Takudo realizes the elder must have suspected a catch, considering the King of Ruin's evil alignment. Picking up on these unspoken cues, Atu calls the old man a fool for thinking Era Takudo is some wicked ghost or malevolent spirit. Setting that aside, since she has no idea what to actually ask for in return, she thinks for a moment and decides it would be good to hear everything the Dark Elves know about the world beyond the forest. Molter offers to share all his knowledge, and Atu demands that the Mazaram clan leave the forest once their pact is fulfilled. Gia Najib is clearly shaken by this demand, and Takudo immediately sees he's much easier to read than the elder. Molter admits nothing would make his clan happier than being allowed to stay in the forest, but Atu won't allow it. Moreover, if the Mazaram want to keep the lives that were spared, they mustn't speak of what happened here. Faced with the weight of this ultimatum, Gia seems ready to protest, but Molter calms him and resumes the negotiations, expressing gratitude for the audience with the king and agreeing to everything Atu laid out. As the Dark Elves depart, Takudo wonders if this is truly the right thing to do. If the Mazaram are exiled, it's likely they'll collapse somewhere along the way, and surely they won't just stand by and watch their own downfall, knowing exile might well mean death. With this on his mind, the King of Ruin extends his hand and invites the elves to become his subjects. Outraged, Atu asks what on earth the king is thinking. He explains he was considering using the refugee system. After all, Dark Elves aren't inherently good or evil, but if they're accepted as refugees into the civilization Takudo plans to build, and if things work like they did in the game, the elves would eventually become evil like them. Atu agrees that it's possible for beings of different evil alignments to coexist, but points out that Dark Elves are nothing like Minagra's main citizens, the homunculi, which could create friction. Takudo admits it's risky, but asks Atu to remember what the homunculi look like, and whether she could handle living with only those creatures as citizens, admitting it's impossible to put up with their ugliness and stupidity for all eternity. Atu turns to the Mazaram and announces her master's intention to soon found a nation. If the elves are willing to become citizens, they'll be protected by the king and promised eternal happiness. Last but not least, Lamacenta lays it all out. The Dark Elves will become evil beings. With that, they're free to choose their own fate, but adding a personal note. Atu assures them their side is a lot more fun than it looks. In the next scene, while walking toward the Dark Elves tribe, Atu kept reminding Takudo to watch his step, since he was barefoot. She pointed out that, although it took some time, the Mazaram had finally agreed to become citizens of Minagra. Even though they hesitated over the idea of becoming evil deep down, they knew from the start this was their best option. Eventually, the pair arrived at the tribe and were greeted by the people, all kneeling in respect. Some looked genuinely excited at the sight of that mysterious entity, while one elf even fainted after feeling the dark miasma swirling around him up close. Soon after, Takudo was led to a throne, and Atu formally welcomed all the Dark Elves as citizens of Minegra, which was now officially founded. From that moment on, the safety of every member of the Mazaram clan would be protected by the great king of Ruin. Still confused, Gia wondered if that was all that would happen. He'd been told that he and his companions would become evil, but he didn't feel any different. Suddenly, a deep-seated hatred welled up inside him in anger toward those who had hunted, mocked, and exiled his people from their own land. Emily felt the same way. She declared that she hated every living being in existence. The same feeling could be seen on the faces of every elf in the tribe. Amid all this, Takuto approached Gia to ask if he was alright, and the Mazaram leader realized that this, too, was a form of happiness, the joy of being cared for. Then, with tears in their eyes, all the elves greeted King Era Takuto, their enthusiasm so overwhelming that even the king himself had no idea why everyone was so worked up. Meanwhile, Atulamacenta simply smiled with pride and satisfaction. A few days after founding the nation, Takuto looked over the map of the continent that Molter had given him and muttered that he was cornered. Atu asked what was going on, and, flailing on the floor like a child throwing a tantrum, the leader complained that their kingdom had the worst possible starting position. There were already 2 major nations on the continent. To the east, the Holy Kingdom of Qualia, a human civilization devoted to the holy god Arlos, and to the west, El-Na, a kingdom of elves who worshipped nature. If either of those nations discovered their evil nation to the south, there would be nothing left, not a single stone standing, especially since Minegra was only just beginning and still incredibly weak. To make matters worse, these cursed lands didn't even have a single natural resource they could harvest. But despite all that, it wasn't only bad news. Minegra did have the homunculi as its base population. They weren't the brightest, but they were happy. And now, for the first time, the nation didn't have to rely solely on them, since the Dark Elves were part of the kingdom and could cover those weaknesses. Speaking of which, Atu's ears twitched. She announced that the elves were back again, ready to report on the outside world. Without delay, the tribal elder met with the King of Ruin, alongside the other elven leader. This time, Gia brought along his assistant, Emily, since she was smart and well-versed in legends and the ways of other nations. Turning to plans for the future, Atu revealed that the Mazaram would be assigned to key positions in Minegra's administration. Molter would oversee the state's affairs, since he could use magic and it was a position of great responsibility. Gia Najiv would lead Minegra's warriors, also taking charge of recruiting new forces. Gia enthusiastically accepted the new role and promised that, if the king commanded, he would show no mercy to any enemy and would display their impaled corpses as a warning. Hearing that, Takuto nearly soiled himself, leaving Gia genuinely puzzled. To smooth things over, Atu explained that Takuto preferred peace. With everyone's role set, Atu told the elves to get some good rest, and when they were in good health, to start building houses. Seeing that Najiv had put his foot in his mouth, Molter expressed his deepest gratitude to the king and insisted that, unlike Gia, who only took pride in his muscles, the elder would prove his worth with wisdom. Gia fired back, promising to show off his own vitality, something an old man like Molter could never match. Unsure what to say, Emily just mentioned that she'd work hard, prompting Atu to whisper to Takuto that these people seemed a little obsessed with work. Finally, she asked if she should order the gathering of resources, but Takuto suggested developing the area without destroying the forest. Hearing that, Atu turned to Elder Molter to ask if they could collect wood while keeping parts of the forest intact. The elf assured her they could. Their people had always lived in harmony with nature. Hearing this, Gia was baffled not just by how peaceful these elves could be, but also by the fact that the King of Ruin wanted to protect the flora and fauna, despite being considered evil. But that wasn't all. Era Takuto declared that his citizens should always be reforesting, though it was clear that the Dark Elves had no idea what that meant. Thinking back to the game's tech tree, Takuto guessed, based on what he'd heard so far, that the people in this world were probably at a technological level somewhere around fortress construction. Atu asked if the Dark Elves were familiar with terms like military magic and the 6 main elements. Molter replied that he knew of the 4 main elements, a basic concept in magic. Emily added that she'd never heard any other nation mention military magic, so Atu realized that this world hadn't reached the level of 6-element magic technology yet, and was behind in other areas, too. Setting that aside, the elf explained that reforestation was the practice of planting trees where they'd been harvested, in order to maintain the environment. Emily admitted this strategy wasn't part of their tradition, while the elder noted that, in reality, it took centuries for trees to mature after they've been cut down. Atu goes on to say that reforestation is a kind of technology that requires all the main elements, and that this knowledge actually comes from their mighty king era Takuto. In fact, she makes a point of letting everyone know that their king is 100 times more amazing than anyone could imagine, and Takuto can't help but feel a bit embarrassed by all the praise. Still, Atu insists that their ruler's wisdom covers countless fields, and that the people of Minagra are blessed to receive his favor. Emily asks if the apples they were given are also the king's invention, and Atu, without batting an eye, confirms they are, then casually adds that the grapes are his creation too. Speaking of which, Emily says she planted the seeds of that purple fruit and can't wait to watch them grow. At that moment, Takuto realizes he could use emergency production to create things that don't even exist in the game, like gunpowder, metals, and oil. As soon as the king notices this, the nation of Minagra is granted the divine privilege, the ruler's ability to produce anything he knows about, with the mana costs varying based on how complex the item is. In the very next moment, a group of soldiers stood guard over religious figures in a region blanketed by snow. One of them remarked that, from what he'd heard, the saint was said to possess a special power, though he didn't really believe it. The other soldier just told him to wait and see. No sooner had the words left his mouth than a horde of goblins attacked the group. The saint stepped forward, preparing to punish the invaders for disturbing the peace of the holy kingdom of Qualia and for the sin of abandoning the holy god Arlos. With a single sweep of her staff, she conjured an extraordinary blaze that wiped out the monsters, causing the sky to magically open and fill the field with beautiful flowers. According to an expedition officer, this power is part of the reason the nation of Qualia is able to keep evil at bay and maintain good relations with the elven nation. The saint buries her enemies in flames and sends them off with flowers. She is one of the 7 great saviors of the Idaragia continent, Saint Selena of the Flowered Burials. Beside her, the cardinal announced that he'd already dispatched the paladins to the nearby villages. The saint, however, brought up the ominous prophecy of apocalypse in the Cursed Lands, insisting that paladins should be sent there to investigate as well. But the cardinal flatly refused, showing any interest in the Cursed Lands, south of the Black Continent, was out of the question, and Central would never authorize the use of paladins for such a mission. Even so, the saint resolved to look into it herself, prompting the man to remind her she was no longer just a simple village girl. Seeing she wouldn't be swayed, he ultimately agreed to send the paladins under his personal command. With that settled, the cardinal walked away, muttering insults about the country bumpkin saint, while she remained focused only on saving the people of that region. Meanwhile, over in the Cursed Lands, Adu the Meyer roused the people to get to work and start building the nation. Part of this was constructing the throne where King Takuto would sit, and soon they revealed the council chamber that would house the sovereign's most suitable seat. The elf was so excited she believed Minagra would soon become powerful enough to rule the land and pierce the very skies. In the midst of this, the elven administrators presented themselves to the king, as planned, to kick off the council meeting. Emily handed the nation's leader a set of garments, so he could finally say he was dressed as a true king. With that done, Atu announced it was time to discuss domestic policies, though Takuto seemed far more interested in admiring his new outfit than deciding the nation's future. Embarrassed, his assistant decided to first discuss things among themselves and only consult the king on certain key points. As the meeting got underway, Molter asked which buildings should be erected first. Gia explained they'd already started preparing the land, leveling the ground and trimming branches. Atu responded that their first project would be a food production facility. After all, no one can wage war on an empty stomach. Molter wondered if the king couldn't just use his powers to create an endless supply of food. Lamacenta took offense at the mere suggestion that their nation's leader should be stuck doing that all the time. Plus, she pointed out, they'd still have to figure out how to distribute the food as the nation grew. After Molter apologized, the king's assistant put a strange plant on the table that made the other elves recoil. She explained it was a meat tree, one of their civilization's food production facilities. It produces mysterious meat that tastes just like human flesh. Molter admitted that not everyone could handle eating human meat every day, but Atu said they'd only plant those trees to start with, and Takuto recognized that everyone has different tastes. Atu added that they'd need a hut to manage the meat tree and a storage facility for the food. Emily took charge of that. Then the tree itself spoke, in a creepy voice, "Be nice to me," sending Emily into a panic. The next topic on the council's agenda was research. In Lamacenta's view, as a small nation, they urgently needed to acquire advanced magical technologies, a sentiment the king shared with excitement. Molter confessed he was also happy to study magic, since it was already a passion of his. He asked what kind of magic they'd be researching, and Atu didn't hesitate: military magic. She explained that normal magic could only strike dozens at once, while military magic could decimate armies of thousands, reshape the land, and offer all sorts of strategic advantages. Molter and Gia were amazed that such spells even existed, and Atu confirmed they'd need to select some talented mages to lead the research. Takudo assured them it wasn't a particularly difficult technology, so it should be developed quickly. With that, Elder Molter enthusiastically took charge of researching military magic. Last on the agenda was military planning. Gia pointed out that they first needed to organize an army. Takudo replied that they wouldn't focus on that just yet, and Lamacenta explained that armies don't produce anything, they only consume resources. Gia understood, but reminded everyone that their current group of warriors wasn't enough to protect the king, making matters worse. Molter revealed that both he and Gia had bounties on their heads as leaders of the Dark Elves. Faced with this situation, King Era Takudo declared that they would create a hero. Atu loved the idea the hero might be expensive to produce, but had virtually no upkeep costs. Gia asked what exactly this hero would be, and the elf explained that in Minegra, there are several heroes who serve the king. All of them are powerful and possess unique abilities. Though they're all monsters in their own right, there are various conditions that must be met to summon them. But soon they should be able to call at least one. What's more, as the king reminded everyone, armies are expensive and draw too much attention. That's why creating a hero could be a smart move. Minegra needed to stay as under the radar as possible while it was still small. And so, they set out to create a hero and give Gia Najeev some much-needed peace of mind. After making that decision, Takudo remarks that, honestly, discussing internal policies is actually kind of fun. Putting that aside, he reflects that they're also collecting mana from their citizens, which means the nation's mana reserves are in good shape. The amount they collect is directly tied to the happiness of the people, so the happier the citizens, the more the nation thrives. Ultimately, it's the ruler's duty to lead their people to the peak of happiness. Meanwhile, over in the Holy Kingdom of Qualia, a warrior named Lonius has his prayer interrupted by what's apparently an emergency, and he's not happy about Vertil's lack of respect for this sacred place. As Lonius tucks his pendant ring into his robe, Vertil jokes that the man's wedding band must have turned into a lucky charm. He asks the names of Lonius's wife and daughter, but Lonius shrugs him off, saying that's got nothing to do with their mission. Vertil insists, explaining that a high-ranking paladin is demanding an answer. Reluctantly, Lonius replies that his wife is named Marcia, and his daughter is Mina. Satisfied, the superior notes that they'll be traveling for a few days, and jokes that he was planning to tease Lonius if he started calling out his wife's or daughter's name in his sleep. Unbothered by the mockery, Lonius points out that, according to rumor, the person involved in their mission is pretty rude, but undeniably skilled and accomplished. Either way, Vertil is annoyed to be sent to the Dark Continent, but Lonius explains it's because they need to investigate a revelation Saint Selena received. If they succeed, they'll earn some favor with the Southern Province's Congress, even if, as a lower-ranked paladin, Lonius will be the first blamed if things go wrong. About the mission itself, Vertil laments that their unit is far too small to handle something as delicate as a revelation since it's just the two of them, and they've been told to fill out the rest of the party with mercenaries. Lonius agrees it's rare for them to investigate outside their borders, and there aren't even guidelines on the size of the forces they send. Vertil can't help but wonder what the bigwigs are thinking, while Lonius reflects that, even among the priesthood and the paladins, it's impossible to know what's happening behind the scenes. Clearly, there must be a reason they forced Vertil to join him just before departure. As they leave the building, the pair runs into a group of soldiers who salute Chief Lonius. Vertil assumes his partner must have hired these mercenaries, and suddenly he's much more motivated to get this job over with. Lonius considers that, despite Vertil's attitude, he's still a high-ranking paladin, which will definitely boost their team's chances of survival. Back in Minegra, things seem to be running smoothly. Takudo watches the whole process unfold, his eyes filled with joy and hope for the future. He's seen visions of his civilization getting started and hitting its stride in the game countless times before, but now he gets to witness it firsthand, as if it were real life. And that's just incredible. Soon after, he and Atu are taken by Emla to visit the nation's residential area. According to their guide, the Dark Elves are experts at building homes up in the treetops. But since they've been prioritizing the meat trees, not many houses have gone up yet. At least the food trees are growing well, and the food storehouse should be finished soon. Emily also mentions that, over at the Institute of Magical Research, Elder Molter is gathering those with magical talent to kick off some new research. Plus, they've discovered a water source nearby and are looking into building an aqueduct. Right now, the building where the king stays also doubles as the public office for paperwork, but in time, they'll put together a proper administrative staff. For now, though, this is the best they can do with what they've got. Takuto is pleased with his subordinate's initiative and resourcefulness. She's even handled things he never asked for. And most importantly, the Dark Elves, who were once so thin and exhausted, are now bursting with life. Emily, a little anxious, asks what the king thinks of everything, since they've all been working so hard to repay the mercy he's shown them. Takuto assures her he thinks it's all amazing and says he's happy to welcome the Dark Elves as citizens. Overwhelmed by being recognized for her hard work, Emily bursts into tears. After regaining her composure, she points out that the meat trees are nearly ready for harvest, all thanks to the agricultural tools the king provided. With a haunting voice, one of the trees claims its fruit is almost ripe enough to eat, sending chills down Emily's spine, while Atu, thrilled, celebrates that they've finally secured enough food to sustain Minagra's residence. Emily then wants to show her superiors the water source she'd mentioned earlier. On the way, as they make their way through the forest, she senses something odd in the woods, and her suspicions are confirmed when they reach the water. Gia and Molter arrive soon after to assess the feasibility of building an aqueduct. But Emily reveals, unfortunately, that the water is no longer good. Molter examines the color and agrees, but Atu takes a sip and declares it's perfectly fine. The Dark Elves are taken aback, but Atu reminds them, this place is known as the Cursed Lands, and this is proof that the area has truly become part of Minagra's domain. Takuto asks the elves to take a deep breath, and as they do, they feel their minds become sharper and their bodies noticeably stronger. Atu explains that the Cursed Lands benefit evil beings while harming those who are neutral or good. Hearing this, Gia Najiv drinks the water and finds nothing wrong with it. Takuto points out that this conquered territory is perfect for defense, and soon, every bit of land belonging to Minagra will be the same. Grateful for the king's immense power, Elder Molter notes that the only downside is that this transformation makes it easier for enemies to spot Minagra's territory, a problem that will only grow as they expand. Once again, Gia urges that they need to form an army. Unfazed, Atu reminds everyone that they'll be creating a hero, to which Molter admits, with some confusion, that he has no idea what that even means. When the moment was right, Atu Lamacinta found it easier to show what she meant rather than keep explaining. Without warning, dark, magical tendrils shot out from her back, slicing through the trees behind her like razors. After that display, the elf revealed that she herself was a hero, and that what they'd just seen was nothing compared to what she could do at her peak. In other words, heroes have the power to wipe out entire armies on their own. Takuto explained that heroes only grow stronger as time goes on, even if they barely lift a finger. So, as long as they manage to keep themselves isolated, Atu alone would be enough to defend the nation for now, and with every passing day, she'd become even more formidable. Still, after his subordinate's little demonstration, the king couldn't help but complain that she didn't have to level half the forest just to prove a point. Once again, the sheer might of King Ira Takuto and Atu Lamacinta left the Dark Elves awestruck, completely won over. They vowed to build a palace worthy of their king as soon as possible. Truthfully, Takuto didn't care much for the idea of living in a palace. He figured he could just live in a regular house like everyone else. The Dark Elves, however, were scandalized by the thought. The idea that the supreme ruler would settle for the same standard as his people filled them with guilt. As Takuto scratched his head, Atu pointed out that, sure, building a palace would be costly, but it could also generate resources, and from what she could tell, it would boost the citizens' happiness as well. With that, Takuto admitted that, once upon a time, he'd actually wanted a floating castle, so maybe having a palace wouldn't be so bad after all. The Dark Elves were fascinated by the idea of a palace soaring through the sky, something that not long ago would have sounded completely impossible. But after everything they'd witnessed, they were starting to believe that with their king, even a flying city might one day exist. Once more, the elves dropped to their knees and swore to serve their lord with all they had. Praying for Minagra's eternal prosperity, Takudo, for his part, was visibly embarrassed by all the attention. But since everyone seemed motivated, he encouraged them to keep up the momentum and continue building up the nation, little by little. Meanwhile, after gathering the expedition team, Virgil praises Lonius for managing to round up so many mercenaries, especially considering that most of them are currently up north, dealing with the northern disturbance. This disturbance began when barbarians suddenly appeared in the northern province of the Holy Empire of Qualia, raiding villages and causing massive damage. The Saint and the Imperial Army were dispatched to deal with the chaos, but things are still far from under control. A mercenary named Bargo cracks a sly smile as he brings up the situation. Lonius quickly tells him not to act like it doesn't concern him, but Bargo just shrugs it off, insisting it's not his problem anyway. Surprised, Virgil asks if Bargo's crew doesn't plan on heading north. Given how generous the payout is, Bargo explains that nobody's willing to risk their necks after rumors confirmed there's a witch involved in the conflict. Either way, Virgil puts the topic to rest, reminding everyone that their path lies south, into the cursed lands where nobody really knows what they'll find. Meanwhile, deep within the cursed lands, a ghostly figure prowls the shadowy forest, face hidden beneath a hooded cloak. As night falls, the group settles down at a tavern. Lonius brings up the witch from earlier, curious if the rumors are true. Bargo brushes it off, saying it's just gossip people love, blaming the northern chaos on some sort of monster. The paladin chimes in, calling it ridiculous, especially since the saint herself is on the case. Bargo agrees, saying the rumor was probably cooked up by heretics. But just as he's about to keep going, Virgil tells him to cut it out. By now, the paladin is clearly drunk and calls for another round, prompting Bargo to ask if he hasn't had enough. Virgil stands his ground, quoting, "After tending to the suffering of the people in your own home, before your family, you may lay aside your vestments." In other words, once the day's work is done, there's nothing wrong with relaxing a little. Lonius, knowing the scriptures inside out, corrects him, pointing out that the holy god Arlos only meant we're excused from our sacred duties around family, not that it's an excuse to drink. Unfazed, Virgil says he's ready for a good old religious debate. But just then, the waitress arrives with another tankard and a bright smile, lighting up his face. Bargo, meanwhile, gets back to business. He points out that there are two paladins going out of their way to investigate the cursed lands of the Black Continent, and he wants to know what's so important down there, because if it really is something like a witch, he and his men are out. Virgil assures him that's not the case. In fact, it's about dark elves who fled to those lands, and the Qualian authorities are worried they might stir up trouble. Bargo nods in understanding. That race of elf is infamous for assassinations and curses. Lonius adds that they could become a threat if they grow stronger in secret. But Virgil tells him not to stress, they're just there to investigate this time. And if things go south, they can just run for it. Bargo is relieved to hear that's part of the plan. But the other paladin questions whether that's really the way a warrior of God should act, since they swore to lay down their lives to fight evil. Virgil counters that seeking glory isn't the point sometimes. You have to take a step back so you can take two forward. After all, everyone here has family waiting for them, and that's reason enough to be careful before diving headlong into danger. That said, the paladin finds himself wondering when he became the old drunk who gives everyone advice. Shaking it off, he raises his tankard and proposes a toast to the expedition to the Black Continent. With a deep sigh, Lonius clutches his pendant ring and asks the holy god Arlos to watch over them all. Meanwhile, on the Black Continent, Takudo gathers the elves for an event that none of them quite understand. He piles up a mountain of flesh fruits from the meat tree, then casts a spell over it, slowly transforming the heap into a long-legged insect. Elder Molter is stunned. He never imagined the king could create new life. Atulamacenta takes the chance to deliver a proud speech about the unmatched power of the King of Ruin, pointing out that this is only a tiny glimpse of what he's truly capable of. If the people of Minagra remain dedicated and happy, it will awaken the king's full potential. It's everyone's duty, she says, to show their absolute devotion to Master Takudo. Once the crowd disperses, Takudo looks relieved the ritual went smoothly, and Atu praises him for managing to produce the insect the proper way. The two are also surprised by how easy it was to gather the necessary resources. But what's even more important now, after this last ritual, they know they can create new units, which means next time, they'll be able to attempt a hero summoning, though they'll need to build up more mana first. Still, with two heroes, they'll have much more confidence in their military strength. Excited, Atu asks whom Takudo will summon first, and without a moment's hesitation, he answers, Isla, the queen of insects, one of Minagra's proud heroines, capable of empowering all insect units, turning long-legged insects into frontline fighters, and producing larvae to boost the workforce. In short, Isla is invaluable both in battle and for domestic affairs, making her the perfect hero for this early stage, when building up strength is everything. That aside, and it's clearly the most important strategic issue, Takuto recalls that the other heroes all have terrible personalities. Atu agrees, since the rest are a bunch of egotistical maniacs and depraved lunatics, every one of them obsessed with world domination. Takuto clarifies that he doesn't mean he'll never summon those types, just that he'd rather avoid it. For now, his top priority is finding a little peace. The next day, as night was approaching, the expedition group led by the two paladins of Qualia ran into a hill giant. Lonius hadn't expected anything less from the Black Continent. He ordered the mercenaries to ready their bows, but Vertil took responsibility for this fight. There was no time to waste. Stepping forward alone, he drew his weapon and began a prayer, channeling the sacred sword art. While Bargo was visibly confused, Lonius explained that this was Qualia's secret technique, weaving prayers into his swordplay to call down divine power. Meanwhile, Vertil was attacked by the giant's enormous club, but he managed to slice the weapon in two with his blessed sword. Lonius added that paladins who received divine power had their physical abilities greatly enhanced, the very power to smite evil filling their bodies. After a series of rapid strikes, Vertil landed a direct blow to the hill giant's chest, tearing it apart. According to Lonius, for a high-ranking paladin, this level of power was on par with a lesser dragon. In other words, monsters like the one they just faced stood no chance. When Vertil finished off the enemy, the mercenaries were left speechless. Lonius praised his companion, saying that with strength like that, they'd finish the mission without any real trouble. Vertil, however, didn't seem so sure, and walked off, not paying much attention to the praise. Back in the Cursed Lands, Takuto was just about to dig into some greasy street food when Atu questioned why he didn't eat healthier meals. Not that there was anything wrong with the occasional junk food, but maybe he could eat something more nutritious once in a while. Takuto admitted he was tired of the whole thing when he was hospitalized. He'd eaten nothing but the worst food possible, all in the name of health. Speaking of which, the king's real concern was with the elf, who seemed to live exclusively on salad, a strange diet for someone supposedly aligned with evil. Leaving that topic behind, Takuto pointed out how hard the elves were working to build the palace, which reminded him he should call Molter and the others for a meeting. Thanks to the long-legged insects, Takuto now had a much better sense of the land around the forest, so it made sense to get the elves' perspective on what to do next. Atu wondered if the king was worried about the neighboring city, since it wasn't part of Qualia, which meant its alignment wasn't necessarily good. In fact, the elf suspected it belonged to some neutral nation out east. It would be wise to decide how to handle that, since being the closest, they'd probably be the first to discover Minagra's existence. Takuto was actually glad they were neutral. If they were good, negotiations would be impossible. In fact, he figured this could work in their favor. But his assistant knew all too well that being optimistic about a potential threat was basically just raising the flag for disaster. And speaking of disaster, just then, Atu sensed an armed group approaching the forest. Not wanting to attract attention, he ordered Atu to drive them off as peacefully as possible, but if that wasn't an option, she was free to do whatever was necessary. At the entrance to the Cursed Lands, the mercenary group prepared to enter under the leadership of Qualia's two paladins. But just as they neared the edge of the forest, a woman appeared, dressed in a black cloak that covered almost her entire body. Vertil demanded to know who she was. The young woman introduced herself as a dark elf who had fled to the woods to survive. She asked what brought the paladins of Qualia here, but Vertil refused to reveal their purpose, instead questioning her presence in the forest. She answered simply that she was living with others who had been through similar hardships. Vertil found it curious that an elf would seek refuge in such a wretched place. Regardless, he revealed only that they had business in the forest. The elf urged them to turn back. Lonius tried to insert himself into the conversation, insisting they were men recognized by God. But Vertil quickly shut him down. He was the one talking now. Lonius, stung by the public rebuke, resented being put in his place when he hadn't even done anything wrong. Vertil insisted he couldn't just turn around and leave because the elf had asked him to, but she pleaded for mercy, explaining that her people were terrified, having endured a long and painful journey to finally find a place to live in peace. Seeing how persistent she was, Vertil wondered if there was something hidden in the forest. She assured him there was nothing but peace and quiet. Still, she wanted to know why he was so obsessed with a simple, dark forest. Finally, Vertil laid it all out. They were there because of a divine revelation warning of a calamity in the area, and they couldn't leave without confirming what was really going on. Lonius, shocked, reminded him that this was supposed to be a state secret. But Vertil silenced him once more. Even if it was a secret, sometimes you had no choice but to speak up. Lonius knew sharing a divine revelation without permission was a serious breach of trust, so he vowed to report it to the authorities when they returned. Even after learning about the revelation, the Dark Elf refused to let the paladins enter the forest, even knowing they were men sent in God's name. With her crimson eyes glowing, she insisted there was nothing to fear in these lands, and that the paladins should return to where they came from. Lonius suspected she was using dark magic to manipulate the situation, and became even more convinced there was a calamity at hand. Vertil, on the other hand, seemed to be falling under her spell, almost ready to call off the mission because of this stranger's words. So, Vertil asked the elf to swear before God that there was nothing wrong with the forest. When she did, he decided they would leave. Lonius couldn't believe his companion was buying any of this, but the other paladin truly believed these elves just wanted to live in peace. Lonius insists he can feel the evil energy radiating from that man. There's just no way someone like that can be trusted. But his companion reminds him that trust is one of the pillars of their faith, and that Lonius shouldn't let fear shake his beliefs. Raising his voice, Vertil shouts that there's nothing wrong with this forest at all, and that this is simply what their investigation has turned up. With that, the man turns on his heel to leave. So, his companion figures he's abandoning the mission and strips him of command right then and there. Vertil whirls around, demanding to know what he thinks he's doing. The younger paladin stamps his foot and argues that not only did Vertil reveal the prophecy, but now he's about to leave without even investigating the territory, making a mockery of God's will. From now on, Lonius says, he's taking charge, and the investigation will proceed right now, here in the Cursed Lands. When Bargo responds to this challenge, as if Lonius really is the leader, Vertil calls him out, but the mercenary chief explains that Lonius is the one paying his group. The elf pleads with them to reconsider, but Lonius orders his men to restrain her. On the other hand, Vertil commands that no one lay a finger on someone so defenseless. So, even though authority has technically been split between the two paladins, Atu sees her attempt at mediation has failed and decides to try a different approach. In the next scene, Lonius jolts awake, blood on his hands. As reality sets in, he sees Vertil standing before a witch, the very creature responsible for slaughtering the mercenaries in such a brutal fashion. Atu laments that things had been going so well, but sadly, not everything in life turns out as planned. Immediately, Vertil orders Bargo to flee to the kingdom and report what just happened. But the mercenary leader reveals that this creature has already taken out their messenger. Atu taunts her enemies, announcing that she's the calamity they've been searching for, and that now she stands right before them. Lonius looks visibly shaken in front of such a menacing figure, but Vertil stands firm, making it clear to his subordinates that all that's left for them now is to fight. He demands everyone fall into battle formation. Atu keeps provoking, as if attacking her would be a ridiculously foolish and pointless choice. Ignoring the creature's words, Vertil orders the mercenaries to unleash a volley of arrows at their target. In response, Lamacenta uses her tentacles to swat away every projectile, shielding herself completely and taking no damage at all. Upping the mockery, she shouts about how much she's loving every second of this. Right then, the senior paladin starts to feel in his bones just how bad things really are. And Atu wholeheartedly agrees, especially because they could have chosen to run if it weren't for the stubbornness of this younger paladin who decided to place his foolish faith above the lives of his comrades and his own. With the elf woman's power and way of speaking, Vertil starts to think she must be a witch. Lonius asks what that means, and the leader confesses he was under strict orders to keep it secret. But in the end, he should have told everyone everything. According to him, whenever the saint receives a revelation and the higher ranks confirm it, this kind of monster is officially deemed a calamity and labeled a witch. In fact, the chaos up north is also being caused by one of these creatures. Having no patience for the conversation, Atu Lamacenta threatens to cut it short. So Vertil commands the mercenaries to fall back, leaving him and Lonius to face the witch alone. No sooner said than done. The two channel their faith, blessing their swords to give them an edge against enemies of darkness. Confident in her strength, Atu unleashes her tentacles at the pair, convinced it'll be enough to finish them off. But the men quickly show that this battle won't be so simple. Relying on their blessings and skill, The duo manages to sever 2 of their enemies' tentacles, something she clearly wasn't expecting. After that, Vertil tells his companion to focus on cutting off the rest, insisting that's the only path to victory. With that strategy in mind, Lonius and Vertil keep hacking away at the witch's limbs, and for a moment, it even looks like they might win. To turn the tide, Atu violently grabs 2 mercenaries and uses them as hostages, making sure her last 2 tentacles can't be cut off, even though she underestimated the paladins. This new idea seems enough to keep her from being defeated after all. Men of God would never kill their own. Despite the heartbreak, Vertil sticks to the plan and tells Lonius to focus solely on the tentacles, because the entire kingdom is at risk if this witch survives. Their purpose now is much greater than whatever personal struggle they're facing in this moment. So, the 2 resume their attack, slicing through both the tentacles and the mercenaries who had been taken as hostages. Instead of panicking, Atu Lamacenta lets out a chilling, wicked grin, making it clear that she'd only been toying with her enemies the whole time. She was never in any real danger, and letting them believe they had a chance was just her way of having fun. With countless other tentacles she can conjure at will, the witch pierces Vertil through multiple parts of his body, dooming the senior paladin to death. With his last breath, he tells Lonius to run until Lamacenta lets his body fall to the ground, blood pooling everywhere, leaving no doubt that this was the end for the paladin. Eyes wide and terrified, Lonius asks how any of this is possible, and Atu replies, dripping with sarcasm, that she never said she only had 6 tentacles. The look of horror in his eyes deepens as the young warrior realizes the witch had only been toying with them from the start, and all the mercenaries now mirror the paladin's terror in the face of this monstrous being. Lonius orders Bargo and his men to scatter in all directions, so the kingdom will at least know what's happening in the cursed lands. Atu Lamacenta grumbles that now she'll just have more work to do, watching the men flee in a panic like a swarm of scattered ants. Meanwhile, Lonius steps up as the last line of defense for his kingdom. When he attacks with his blessed sword, he realizes the Dark Elf is wielding the same weapon with the same holy power, which rattles him even further. Ever the cynic, she explains that she stole the paladin's techniques by killing him. But that's not all. In a true show of cruelty and strength, she reveals she didn't just steal his skills, but also all his memories and feelings. Every effort he made to become such a formidable opponent, a true representative of God, now belongs to the witch. She makes sure Lonius understands that as she comes at him with terrifying speed. To prove she has Vertil's memories, she points out that Lonius's wife is named Marcia, and his daughter is Mina. Hearing those names, the fear that was already in his eyes becomes utterly overwhelming. Atu reveals that Vertil thought of his comrade's safety until his dying breath, exactly what a senior paladin, a true hero, should do. Sadly, the elf loves to remind him that it all went to waste because of the boy's misguided courage and his need to follow stupid rules. Trying not to let her words shake him, Lonius says Vertil's will and hope will live on as long as the mercenaries manage to escape and warn the kingdom about this calamity. But as soon as he says this, he hears the dying scream of a mercenary echo in the distance. Atu Lamacenta reveals she has allies of her own. She's positioned dark elves to stop any possible survivors from escaping the battle. At that moment, whatever hope Lonius had feels like it's slipping right through his fingers, leaving only total and utter despair behind. In one final act of heroism, the warrior of God charges the enemy with everything he has. In the next scene, as the sun begins to set, Lamacenta speaks to the subdued paladin about how things might have turned out differently if only Lonius had listened to Vertil. The young paladin could have returned to his beloved family, living a quiet, peaceful life, grateful for God's blessing and the serenity that would have surrounded him. The forest would have remained calm, and Atu would have gone to bed hoping that peace would last forever. But now, it's time to talk about what will actually happen. The future Lonius chose. The paladin will die, and so will his family. Atu will hunt down his wife and daughter, torturing them so mercilessly that both will beg for death. After that, the elf will visit every village and town the paladins passed through on their way to the forest, wiping out every living soul, just because she can. And when people ask why this is happening, Atu will simply say it's all Lonius' fault, the paladin who decided to confront a peaceful witch instead of just living his ordinary life in peace. Lonius, desperate, tells her to stop, but Atu keeps going, sharing a lesson she once learned from someone precious. When you're underestimated, it'll be your end. So when that happens, you kill no matter what. That's why Atu will kill, to make sure she's never underestimated again. It doesn't matter if it's hundreds, thousands, or even millions, she'll wipe them all out, no exceptions. and according to her, it's all because of Lonius' decision. As Atu Lamacenta flashes a wicked grin, the man starts to cry and begs her not to go through with it. Atu continues, saying she knows Lonius was probably a good man. He believed in God and always tried to do the right thing. But that's exactly why she despises those who think they're just. With that, Atu says goodbye to the paladin and tells him to watch the real meaning of calamity from his VIP seat in heaven, while everyone he loves and all the innocent are slaughtered for no reason at all. Hearing these words, Lonius lets out a scream of maddening despair until, at last, he's killed by the so-called Witch of the Cursed Lands. Once that ordeal is over, Atu is found by Gia Najeev and his soldiers. The Dark Elf commander reports that the fleeing humans have been taken care of. Lamacenta announces she'll be heading back to the forest. But before she can leave, Gia asks if she's really going to do all those terrible things she threatened the paladin with. Atu just laughs and says she'd never do that after all. She's a pacifist. She was just having a little harmless fun, teasing him to lighten the mood. Still, she can't waste time here. She needs to get back to the king. As she turns to go, Najeev asks if there's something on her mind. She admits there is something the king needs to hear right away. With that, Atu Lamacenta goes to Era Takudo and reveals that there are witches in this world, a unit that doesn't exist in the original universe of the game Eternal Nations, which means this isn't the world of the game, but some sort of parallel version where the game's mechanics still exist up to a point, but with new elements and characters. Takudo is frustrated by this, knowing it'll only complicate Minagra's plans going forward. But Atu points out there's an upside to this world being different. For example, besides her ability to steal the powers of those she defeats, she can now steal some of their memories too. Takudo, excited, notes this will help them find out what's happening in Qualia without needing a full-blown investigation. On that note, the elf reports that Qualia is drained, thanks to the disaster in the northern province. Still, there's a chance they'll try something against Minagra after what happened to their paladins today. The king, however, feels safe Qualia doesn't know anything about them. What actually worries him is the disaster known as the Northern Disturbance. According to the memories Atu stole, it's being caused by a witch. But apparently Verdal didn't know much more than that, and it's possible nobody in Qualia knows either. Except that this witch is capable of causing damage on the scale of an entire army. Apparently, this monstrous being is called Irakino, the Devouring Witch. Somewhere in a quiet village in the northern province, Irakino, in her childlike form, skips cheerfully through the ruins and the victims of the calamity she herself unleashed. Mimicking the tick-tock of a clock, she says, "The gods never roll the dice. There are no dreams, no hope anywhere. Life is just killing time." Now, her plan is to move on to the next town and bring chaos there as well, raising the dead from the village to fight as her allies in her wicked campaign. Back with Takudo. Now that the northern disturbance is real and caused by someone with the destructive force of an army, the King of Ruin imagines that this witch must have come to this world the same way they did. That aside, it's time to prepare, even if the threat is still far to the north. Takudo had considered joining forces with this troublesome figure, but since she's aligned with evil, that's off the table. Given that the witch is a hero unit, Takudo initially thought of summoning Ayla, but she's a unit better suited for resource production than combat, not the best call in a crisis. To go toe-to-toe with a witch who can raise cities, they'll need a hero just as strong. Atu, agreeing with her master, promises to gather the mana needed to create such a unit. Meanwhile, to contain both Qualia and the northern threat, the King of Ruin plans to forge an alliance with a nation that has a neutral alignment, the only viable option. As they've discussed before, the country to the east fits that profile, making this Minagra's golden opportunity to grow stronger while things get more dangerous. But for that, they need to find out if this nation is willing to join forces. Elsewhere, far from all this, a humanoid shouts to the people gathered about what the staff-bearer just did. She managed to defeat several barbarians with ease. The staff-bearer then orders the elders to be taken down from their pedestal and tells her followers to deal with the bodies before any celebration begins. Next, more enemies appear. The staff-bearer quickly orders the fighters to form up and sends the messengers to call for reinforcements. Though she tries to maintain a confident front, the humanoid leader has no idea what's actually happening in her own lands. Back in Minagra, Atu worries she might have soured the king's mood by going a little too far against those paladins. But contrary to what she expected, Takudo is perfectly calm. He assures her he would never take offense at anything his assistant does. After all, he trusts the elf deeply and asks her not to worry about it. All he wants is for her to keep supporting him. Hearing those words, Atu gets emotional. promising she'll stand by the king no matter what comes, whatever the order may be. Then, we see the advent of the Apocalypse chain event begin in the game. Soon after, 2 young elf girls emerged from the forest, making their way toward the still under construction city of Minagra, wondering aloud why they were even alive. Some time later, the royal palace was finally completed by the workers. Well, according to Atu, they still had a mountain of problems to deal with, but at least this building was where the true beginning of their world would take place. Thrilled to be sitting on his throne, Takuto was already planning to expand the palace as soon as they had the time. Excited by the thought, Atu remarked that the palace should pierce the skies and send roots deep into the ground. But the good mood didn't last. Atu suddenly remembered something dreadful. They didn't have a single servant attending to their master. To her, that was a huge failure in her management. Takuto tried to explain that it wasn't such a serious problem, but the elf took it dramatically, acting like it bothered her 10 times more than it did him, and insisted the king choose his attendant immediately. Takuto would love for it to be someone easy to talk to, since communication was one of his biggest weaknesses. He wanted to be a more approachable king, but he could barely hold a proper conversation with the Dark Elves. That's when Lamacenta had a brilliant idea and asked for some time. Instead of feeling hopeful, the only thing Takuto could think was that nothing good ever came from this girl getting excited about something. Before long, Minagra's 3 most important Dark Elves appeared before their ruler. Without hesitation, Atu ordered Elder Molter to gather all the little girls to fulfill the king's wish. Molter was stunned, and so was Takuto. In the middle of the confusion, Atu explained that her plan was to have the girls serve as Takuto's attendants so he could practice conversation. When the elder coldly questioned the reasoning behind such an order, she cheerfully answered, "His Majesty likes young girls." Outraged at the impression she was giving the elves, the king quickly explained what he actually wanted. From what Molter gathered, Takuto wished to have innocent children around so he wouldn't feel bound by conventional thinking when speaking. Relieved, Najiv noted that children often had ridiculous ideas, but sometimes those ideas could spark revelations in adults. Nervously, Atu added another reason. The king wanted to avoid pulling too many adults away from the workforce, since they were still short on workers in several sectors. The attendants would only handle small, daily tasks that even children could manage. Najiv countered that a boy could do that as well. But Takuto quickly argued that they had to be girls because of future leadership. He intended to give more women the opportunity to study for the good of the nation. Hearing this, the Dark Elves were stunned by their leader's wisdom, leaving Takuto relieved that his desperate excuse had actually worked. Molter praised the sovereign's excellent policies, and Gia remarked on how forward-thinking this was for Minagra's future talent. Atu, tired of the chatter, simply ordered the servants to bring their daughters, and all the king could think was how he might finally improve his communication skills. The reality, however, turned out to be nothing like he'd imagined. The moment the little girls were handed over to him, they started wailing uncontrollably, giving him no peace at all. The poor man twisted in frustration as Atu explained that this was normal for children, though that didn't stop her from scolding Elder Molter for bringing such crybabies. Molter apologized, but sadly, those were all the girls in the kingdom. While Atu grumbled that they were all too frail, Gia asked if the elder had at least allowed the twins to come. Stammering, the old man admitted he hadn't. It would have been too disrespectful in his view. Lamacenta wanted to know why, so Molter explained that there was a pair of orphan twins who were certainly well behaved, but he believed they were unsuitable to serve the king. Not wanting to get into details, and fed up with the crying, Atu ordered them to bring the twins anyway, only for Najiv to reveal he'd already anticipated this. Unlike the elder, he was a sharp young man who always thought 2 steps ahead, much to the king's delight. And so, the twins were brought before Era Takumi, the king of Ruin. The younger one, with short hair, politely introduced herself as Karia Elfur, while the older was named Maria. For some reason, Adu suspected they had a dark past, so she asked Karia about the marks on her body. The girl answered sadly that it was from an illness which made the king pity her. Curiously, Karia believed she deserved it. Molter stepped in to clarify that these were scars left behind by a plague, even though the plague itself had long passed. Atu then asked about the older sister's past, and Karia revealed that something cruel had happened to her. Maria herself explained that she had eaten her mother. The shocking statement made Atu demand answers from the elder. Visibly shaken, Molter explained it had been a difficult decision. Their mother had been a proud woman, and the clan would never forget the sacrifice she'd made for everyone. From just that, Takuto felt he understood. The Mazaram clan had traveled for a long time after being exiled from their home, and the extreme hardship they'd faced forced them to make equally extreme choices, especially in the face of starvation. In Lamacente's mind, that unyielding determination was admirable, but it came with a but. Suddenly, Maria stepped forward and remarked that the king was white. He asked what she meant, but not even the girl knew how to explain it. Regardless, the sovereign asked if she was willing to take care of him, and she answered yes, smiling. With that, the King of Ruin declared that from this day forward, Maria Elfuer was a candidate for leadership in Minagra. Atu was startled that the king was holding such a proper conversation with a little girl. While Takuto asked Karia if she wasn't afraid, she simply replied that her duty was to be by her older sister's side, and if her sister wished to serve the king, then she would do her best as well. Atu decreed that from now on, the twins would work to care for the king. That night, Molter returned to the palace to share something important with the sovereign. Speaking honestly, he revealed that the twins had not cried even once since losing their mother. With hearts closed off to such a degree, the elder asked the king to treat them with patience and compassion. A few days later, Maria and Karia were hard at work as servants to the nation's supreme leader. One morning, the older sister rushed in with a glass of water for Takuto, but ended up spilling it all over him. Karia hurried to dry his majesty, though it looked more like she was sanding a wall before painting it. Atu walked in, grumbling that the two of them were still about as delicate as a herd of stampeding wildebeests, but Takuto stayed patient, asking his aide to calm down. Clearing her throat, Lamacenta announced that a meeting was about to begin. The twins would be attending, so they had better watch themselves and not cause any trouble. Once they were seated for the meeting, Atu opened the discussion on domestic affairs and asked the head of construction for a status report. Emily explained that now that the palace was complete, they had a bit of extra manpower. The lumber stockpile was steady, and the kingdom's resources were in good shape enough to start on a new facility. On that note, Atu recommended to the king that they move ahead with the building they had discussed in the last meeting. When Takuto gave his approval, she instructed Emily to begin construction on a clinic. Takuto reflected that a clinic would safeguard the health and safety of the citizens, and the cost of building it would be relatively low. Since Minagra was short on workers, Emily had also been tasked with overseeing resource management. She reported that the internal gathering of food and materials was going well, and with the king's help, the kingdom could produce daily goods they'd never be able to make otherwise. The drawback was that this process consumed mana, and the balance between spending and generating it wasn't great. Atu knew that emergency production came at a price, but since it was still a necessary expense, the only option was to keep using it while prioritizing buildings and research that would increase mana output. Speaking of mana, the king's aide requested an update on research. Elder Molter, head of that department, stood to announce that the research on military magic had been successfully completed. For now, he was the only one capable of using it, but with training, his subordinates would soon master it as well. According to him, casting powerful spells with the mana of ruin supplied by the palace would be crucial for the future. Still, he doubted it would be used to its full potential because of the king's policies. Atu admitted that was a problem. Such magic could be very useful, though not so much for domestic affairs. Regardless, she ordered the planning to move forward, officially starting research on the 6 core elements of magical technology. Takuto considered that while the kingdom leaned heavily toward magic, that came with both advantages and disadvantages. Finally, Lamacenta called for the military report. Gia Najeev reported that the army had acquired 5 new longlegs, which were currently surveying the uncharted territories surrounding the cursed lands. Unlike the forest, the entire area beyond was open plains. The goal was to remain discreet, so bold investigations were off the table for now. Since the aim was to quickly explore the surrounding areas, Atu ordered all longlegs to patrol the borders, believing that she alone was enough to defend the kingdom. The elf also formally announced the production of a new hero for Minagra. Takuto's choice was Isla, the queen of insects. The name made the dark elves uneasy, but Lamacenta brushed aside their concerns and asked about the resources needed for the summoning. Molter promised to provide a full report, but confirmed they already had the necessary lumber and rations stockpiled at the ritual site. All they were missing now was the mana. Hours later, after a round of spirited debates and resolutions, mostly between the ever-fiery Gia and Molter, the day's agenda came to a close. The king's aide asked for his thoughts on the meeting's outcome, and he decreed that everything agreed upon should begin at once, commending his subordinates for their determination. In short, Minagra would build a clinic, research the 6 core elements, and produce the nation's new hero, Isla, the queen of insects. On the way out of the meeting, Maria accidentally bumped into the king, dropping the stack of papers she was carrying. Karia quickly apologized on her sister's behalf and rushed to gather them up. But in their haste, the two ended up tearing one sheet apart while grabbing it at the same time. Once again, Takuto showed patience, assuring them it was fine. As he sat back on his throne, Maria suddenly asked if he was a bad person. He told her his alignment was, indeed, evil. Hearing that, she pressed him on why he hadn't killed them yet. Horrified by her sister's bluntness, Karia scrambled to explain that the older twins simply wanted to understand why their leader had shown them so much mercy. According to Karia, Maria was upset that someone evil could be so kind. Faced with their confusion, Takuto explained, "A good person is only allowed to do what's right. They can't harm or steal from others." With that in mind, he asked the twins what they thought bad people could do. They answered that bad people could only do bad things, commit terrible atrocities. But the king told them the beauty of being evil was that you could do whatever you wanted, good or bad. Being evil meant being selfish enough to be free, to follow your own sense of what's right, without caring what others think, and moving forward without looking back. In short, there was nothing wrong with being kind. Karia shouted that it wasn't fair, while Maria asked if he wouldn't eventually be punished for it. He replied that if he killed the good person who came to punish him first, then no, he wouldn't be. He then asked if their mistakes so far had been intentional, and they admitted they had. When he asked if they feared death, they nodded. Takuto concluded that the twins couldn't forgive themselves for surviving at the cost of their mother's life, and so they sought redemption in death. That was why they tried so hard to provoke him into punishing them to that extent. Considering this, Takuto explains that Maria and Karia are alive because their mother's love triumphed over fate. Painful as her choice might have been, it was the very thing that gave the two girls a chance to still be here, and that, in itself, was the right thing to do for their mother, and for them. They should carry pride in that. In return for their mother's love, Maria and Karia should live their lives however they wish, because only then will she, too, feel proud of her daughters. In the end, the king asks the girls to always remember that they are free to make mistakes for better or for worse. Hearing this, the two burst into uncontrollable tears. A few minutes later, Otto arrives to deliver some information to the king. Frowning at the sight of the two girls asleep on the throne, from the look of things, Takuto had grown quite close to them. Be that as it may, she reports that the city they had been investigating is called Dragonton, part of Forngon, a neutral country inhabited by both humans and beastmen. This nation is run under a parliamentary system led by shamans known as staff bearers. As a multiracial and multicultural city, Takuto believes its diplomacy holds promise. However, Dragonton's isolation will make trade and the supply of goods to Minagra costly. On that note, Atu Lamacenter reveals that the city holds a dragon vein mine, a powerful source of mana that should, if possible, be brought under Minagra's control. At the moment, Dragonton is on high alert due to attacks by goblins and ogres. It doesn't seem their homeland intends to send reinforcements, as the city lies in a remote region. If Minagra were to take in the war refugees, it would be an opportunity to increase their population, and if they stepped in during this critical moment, they could gain considerable influence in the region should the invaders be driven out. With that, the King of Ruin orders that diplomats be sent to Forngon. Sometime later, Atu Lamacenter runs into a delegation from Dragonton, accompanied by other representatives of Minagra. Halfway to those lands, their dark auras send shivers through the locals. Terrified, one of the warriors at Tanukapoli's side almost loses control, until the leader quickly orders her men to restrain their instincts. Atu tells her subordinates to fall back and remain on alert, while the Dragonton envoy grows increasingly tense with the heavy atmosphere settling in the air. Suddenly, young Pepe steps forward and insists on handling the situation himself. With his peculiar brand of cheerfulness, he greets the sinister beings and casually asks their names. Ado quickly hides her tentacles, and Tanukapoli burns with rage at the brat's boldness. Once tempers settle, the elf walks alongside the cow in the forest, surprised to learn that she too has sought an audience with the King of Ruin, especially since Minagra had only just dispatched a delegation to Dragonton. Pepe confirms that this was the very reason they bumped into each other by chance along the way. Excited, the boy launches into the stories of their adventures to get there. Tanukapoli apologizes for the little chatterbox, while Atu changes the subject, asking whether it was acceptable for the beastmen to leave their soldiers behind. Tanukapoli explains that the miasma from the Dark Elves is far too strong for her men to endure, so she ordered them to wait outside. What she doesn't reveal is the real reason. They're about to meet King Takumi himself. and no one knows what to expect. Every precaution must be taken. Hours later, standing before Minegra's dreaded ruler, Tonokapali grips her staff tightly. The aura radiating from this being is so overwhelming that she can barely fathom the true extent of his power. It feels as if Takumi is darkness itself. With such a presence now looming close to her city, the Dragonton leader bitterly regrets a choice that has backfired on her. But before any of this began, long before encountering Minegra's delegation, Pepe had subdued a giant using his plant arm magic, proudly declaring the area safe. Around him, allies praised the young high priest's cleverness, and rather than shy away from the admiration, he demanded even more applause. Of course, the giant soon broke free from its leafy prison and attacked again. At that moment, Tonokapali appeared and combined her plant arm magic with her swamp spell, tightening the giant's restraints. With their foe fully exposed, the sorceress ordered the warriors to finish it off. After the battle, the cow cracked her staff over Pepe's head when he dared call her grandma. She was, after all, still a young and healthy woman of only 240 years. Besides, as the only youth in the city wielding a staff, the boy ought to act like a leader instead of clowning around. To be honest, the seasoned mage worried about his future, especially now that they were about to venture into the cursed lands. Pepe, who hadn't even realized that was the plan, got another scolding for his ignorance. She reminded him that the elders had seen signs of an impending apocalypse emanating from that place and ordered them to investigate. If the barbarian raids on Dragonton continued, the city would eventually fall, isolated and cut off from reinforcements from the capital. Their survival depended on discovering whether the cause of the attacks lay within the cursed lands before it was too late. Tonokapali herself had insisted that Pepe join the expedition, but now she wondered if she should have ignored the elders and left the boy behind, instead of dragging him into such danger. Lost in her reflection, the cow mage was startled when Pepe suddenly appeared inside the palace, cheerfully introducing himself to Takumi and inviting the king to be his friend. Horrified, Tonokapali rushed to beg forgiveness from the nation's leader. Yet Takumi smiled, accepted the boy's offer, and assured everyone they would get along well. Atu Lamacenta, who had worn a stern expression until now, clapped her hands along with the dark elves to celebrate their king's very first friendship. To mark the occasion, a banquet was held in Minegra's palace. Tonokapali was served a drink and found herself enchanted by its unique flavor. Seeing her delighted expression, Atu proudly proclaimed that their nation produced the most delicious beverage in the world. The cow admitted she had never expected to taste something so wonderful here, nor to find such fine tableware in a place like this. Curious, Pepe asked what the drink was. Maria explained that it was apple juice. At once, Tonokapali knew trouble was brewing. And she was right. Pepe leapt from his seat, pestering the guests, complimenting Gia's muscles, and showing off his magic to Molter. Watching all this unfold, Takumi thought to himself how remarkable the boy's social skills were. He himself could never blend so effortlessly into a crowd. At the same time, Tonokapali found herself at a loss. Pepe was her very first friend, and she had no idea how to handle it, given her dreadful talent for communication. To complicate matters, Minegra was deep in delicate negotiations with Forngon, and she couldn't afford to be swayed by rhetoric. She needed to prove they weren't a hostile nation, which meant showing as much warmth as possible. With all this in mind, Takumi called Pepe over and asked if he would like to play a game. The sudden proposal made the entire banquet tense up, and a heavy mood fell over the hall until Pepe, of course, simply grinned and agreed with joy. And so, the two sat at a table surrounded by various game boards, though Tonokapali broke into a cold sweat, worried about the boy's unpredictable behavior. The truth was that King Takumi seemed delighted with the child's company. That alone could become a powerful tool in strengthening ties between the two nations. At one point, Pepe praised the apple juice and the entertaining games of Minegra, declaring he was happy to have come. In fact, he even suggested they sell the juice to Forngon. While Tonokapali nearly tore her hair out, Takumi recognized the opportunity. He knew the time for negotiations would come, even if he didn't give an answer that night. At last, after the banquet, Pepe stuffed himself to the brim, only to take another blow to the head from his countrywoman for getting a little too full of himself. Atu then asked the woman why they had come to Minegra, a question that once again raised the tension in the room. A bit hesitant, the cow admitted that her country had recently been under attack by barbarians. Atu pointed out that this was unusual, since barbarians generally avoided striking large cities. Tonokapali agreed, but explained that, since these attacks were happening on a massive scale, her nation had decided to investigate the cause of these hordes' sudden appearance. Takumi asked if Dragonton was lacking in military power, and the question made Tanukapali even more anxious, afraid that saying the wrong thing could put her city at risk. She quickly assured them that they were capable of repelling the threat, but emphasized that prevention was always better than cure, especially because the behavior of these hordes was stranger than usual. Atu agreed. The attacks were far too large to simply ignore. Tanukapali then added that 2 of Dragonton's strongest forces, including the staff bearers, had already been dispatched to investigate, and she hoped this would be seen by Minagra as a sign of trust. Elder Molter acknowledged the reasoning, as did the other dark elves, but then Pepe opened his mouth. According to him, it seemed like Dragonton had sent out their forces because they were terrified of being destroyed and desperately needed a solution. Being contradicted so bluntly made Tanukapali want to crush the brat, but Atu reassured her that Minagra had no intention of harming Forngon. Of course, she understood why beastmen might be suspicious of what evil beings like them were plotting. As she stressed, the kingdom's interests always came first, and, as Takumi made a point of adding, what mattered most at that moment was peace, so their nation could grow. With an innocent smile, Atu admitted that Minagra was an evil domain that loved peace. Besides, if Dragonton were to fall, Minagra would certainly be the Horde's next target. In other words, the matter concerned them directly as well. Eager for military aid, Tanukapali reflected that building Dragonton around the Dragon Vein mine had taken enormous effort, and Minagra's willingness to help probably had something to do with that. But with her city's very existence on the line, all she could do was go along with it. Atu asked the king's opinion, and Takumi replied that friends should help one another, since Pepe's slip-up had put Dragonton in a delicate spot during the negotiations. Tanukapali asked what they wanted in return. Atu immediately mentioned the Dragon Vein mine, which left the cow visibly shaken. Pressing forward, Lamacenta clarified that Minagra had no problem managing the mine jointly with Dragonton, since they didn't currently need such a large supply of mana. However, Minagra did want the right to choose which element the raw energy would be converted into. Tanukapali pointed out that converting pure mana into specific elements was a technology that would take at least another 10 years to develop. But since they had brought it up, maybe Minagra had already achieved the breakthrough. Faced with this twist, the staff-bearer of Dragonton declared that Pepe was an idiot, probably the biggest fool Forngon had ever seen. Even so, he was still the nation's future, destined to one day lead as a staff-bearer himself. And Pepe had one special gift. He could sense the nature of people. That was why the sorceress urged him to make the decision. He had that right as the future head of their homeland. Smiling, Pepe simply declared that what he wanted most was friendship between Minagra and Forngon. In the following scene, Minagra's leaders gathered to review the agreements from the negotiations. Emily recalled that they had agreed to export provisions and toys to Forngon. In return, they would import daily necessities and metal goods. For Molter, it was a relief to secure those items without depending on the king. Atu celebrated the fact that the greatest prize of all was access to the Dragon Vein mine in exchange for military aid. Molter noted that they had gained an advantage thanks to Pepe's blunder, but admitted that the boy's clumsy nature was concerning. Takumi agreed, though deep down he thought that if it weren't for the boy, the friendship between the two nations might never have come so easily, and the agreement might not have been reached in time. With that in mind, the King of Ruin even wondered if the child had revealed Dragonton's weakness on purpose. Returning to the matter at hand, Atu raised the question of future relations with Forngon. Karya asked what kind of country they truly were, and since no one knew, Molter insisted that learning their customs and traditions would be crucial to strengthening their bond. For Atu, the problem was that their capital, Crescent Moon, was too far away, so any investigation would take time. For now, that matter would have to wait. Takumi then ordered that aid to Dragonton be prioritized. Molter reminded them that they would need some formal pretext to justify entering another nation. The council floated the idea of sending someone to pay respects before dispatching a formal delegation. Molter volunteered, but everyone agreed that the Chancellor and Minister of Magic was far too important for such a task. Instead, they decided to send Maria and Karya, who held no official positions yet but were deeply trusted. Takumi worried that the mission would be dangerous for them, but Molter reminded him that both were being trained as future leaders of the nation. This would be their first chance to gain real experience. Even so, when the king still showed concern for their safety, Atu Lamacenta offered to accompany them. Molter, however, argued that this wasn't wise, since she was Takumi's closest confidante. Hearing such sweet words, the young elf was utterly enchanted, overjoyed that she had been acknowledged as so close to her great leader. In the end, Carrier recalls something Takumi once told them. They are free. Thinking about the freedom they have, the two decide they want to be useful to their master. And so, they're willing to take whatever risks await them in Forngone. After much insistence from the girls, Takumi finally gives in and accepts their proposal. Eda, however, can't help but feel jealous, watching the man she loves yield to the sweet, persuasive pleas of other women. On top of that, Emily points out that it would be madness to send just the two young women alone into a nation at war, but the king already has someone in mind to escort them. After the meeting, Takumi settles back into his throne, trying to unwind after such heavy discussions, but Atu refuses to spare him from her wave of jealousy. She makes it perfectly clear that she won't stand by and watch any more intimate moments between His Majesty and his favorite little girls. The poor king, of course, scrambles to justify himself in every way he can. Speaking of those two, they soon appear on the scene, advising him to simply tell Atu what's really on his mind. And so, Takumi approaches his most loyal aide and thanks her for always thinking of him. Era had been brooding over recent events, which ended up worrying her friend. But Takumi always knew he'd only made it this far because she was by his side. That's why he makes it clear that he needs Atu, and asks her to lighten up because to him, she is truly one of a kind. Lamacenta nearly bursts from the inside out upon hearing those words, her imagination running wild. She can only think about when those two will finally get married and live happily ever after, in a cozy home with a fireplace and a dog. After that, Takumi takes Maria and Karia to visit Minagra's clinic, a low-cost facility where the population's illnesses are treated. But the real reason for their visit is that the girl's escort is waiting inside. Atu wonders if it's who she thinks it is, and the king confirms it's the unit he had only just created not long ago. As the three figures drew closer, Karia's face tensed with fear, while Maria's lit up with excitement. Yet, despite their eerie appearance, the trio behaved in a silly, almost childlike way, brimming with enthusiasm at the chance to meet King Takuto. Their joy was so disarming that Atu gave her approval, and the king explained that he had created them as a precaution to be ready for the worst. Still, he'd let them live freely, believing they would be perfect for such a role, though he never imagined he'd actually need them so soon. Even so, Karia, still uneasy, asked who they were. Takuto replied that they were combat medics healers capable not only of treating wounds and illnesses, but also of fighting and protecting the two young elves. On behalf of the king, Atu Lamacenta then announced that the medics would accompany Maria and Karia to Dragonton, charged with defending them as well as observing the culture and current state of the land. The mention of such a human-like mission blending culture, observation, and protection sent the trio into even greater excitement. Their bizarre behavior left the elves bewildered, but the doctors swore they were exemplary human beings, born for tasks like these. Their spontaneous little performance completely won over Maria, who rushed forward to greet them as comrades. Seeing this, Takuto felt a kingly urge to reward their loyalty, declaring that he would grant them a prize for protecting the two girls and following his commands. Since they seemed oddly obsessed with the subject, the sovereign gave them proper human names, Ikiro, Gyro, and Saburo. The three beamed with delight. Reflecting on it, Takuto realized that in this world, unlike the game units, had personalities of their own, and a name made them feel like true individuals. Upon receiving his, Ikiro vowed to honor the blessing by carrying out his duty flawlessly. Gyro agreed that such an act was deeply human, and Saburo echoed the sentiment. Soon even Maria was caught up in the doctor's theatrics, which made Takuto wonder if perhaps he had gone too far. Curious, he asked Karia what she thought of it all. She answered nervously that they would do their best. Concerned, Atu reassured the girls that if they ever found themselves in trouble, they could always turn to her. Sometime later, in the city of Dragonton, its mayor sat fuming. She had left behind her perfectly ordered elven homeland, convinced she'd finally find a handsome husband, start a family, and live a comfortable life. Instead, all she ever did was drown in endless work and suffocating bureaucracy. Slamming her mug on the desk, she cursed the fact that she now had to rely on the forces of darkness to defend her city, especially when she had never even heard of this so-called Dragonton before. Just then, someone stepped into Mayor Antic's office. In a flash, she dropped her aggressive demeanor and forced on a sweetness that was anything but genuine. Embarrassed, her assistant explained that some visitors wanted to meet with her, since they had no appointment. The mayor immediately demanded that they be sent away after all. Her time was worth more than gold, and anyone who dared interrupt her deserved to die. But then her secretary mentioned they were emissaries from Minagra. At that, Antic nearly exploded, berating her staff for not saying so earlier. This was top priority. And so, the leader of Dragonton received her guests, introducing herself as Antali's Antic, once again putting on her mask of force charm. Still, the haunting aura of Minegra's combat medics unsettled her. She couldn't fathom why the staff bearers had allied with such terrifying creatures, though she dared not say it out loud. Instead, she graciously thanked the travelers for coming. When the Elfuer sisters stepped forward, she praised their manners. But inwardly all she could think about was the dark reputation of the Dark Elves and how Minegra had accepted them as citizens. Yet they weren't the true threat here. The real concern was the three standing behind them. Antic had heard whispers long ago of an assassin unit of Dark Elves, and she wasn't about to let her guard down. Then, at the mention of their surname Elfuer, she recalled Tonakopoli once speaking of these very girls as the future leaders of Minegra, personally trained by the King of Ruin himself. Realizing just how important her guests were, Antic visibly flinched, leaving the young emissaries confused. If she handled this wrong, it could spell disaster. With her nerves laid bare, she asked what business had brought them to Dragonton. When Caria and Maria hesitated, Gyro stepped forward, offering to speak on their behalf. He explained that the visit was simply a response to Pepe, the staff-bearer's invitation to enjoy the city. It was meant as the first step toward friendship between their domains, a symbolic gesture of unity. He added that the girls were still young and learning how to handle such matters, so official talks should be avoided for now. Relieved, Antic smiled. They weren't here to negotiate treaties, just to share a warm greeting and taste the local delicacies. Still, she knew better than to risk upsetting them. And since she was dying for an excuse to escape her work, she offered to personally guide the sisters around the region. Winning their favor, after all, would surely earn her praise in the eyes of Minegra's king. With that in mind, Antic escorted the pair through Dragonton's sights, especially the bustling street market, eager to delight them with its array of foods. Watching from afar through magic, Takuto felt reassured that everything was going well, though Atu grumbled that he had abandoned her to deal with the paperwork they'd promised to finish together. By nightfall, Minegra's emissaries bid farewell to the mayor, leaving with a favorable impression of her. Later, back in their quarters, the sisters sat down to review the day's findings. Caria asked Maria for her thoughts, and Maria, with a troubled look, admitted that what struck her most was the fear she felt seeing so many hungry, insecure people wandering the city streets, weighed down by the war. The doctors were astonished by the young girl's remark, and when Caria revealed that her sister was sensitive to the emotions of others, able to grasp people's feelings to a certain extent, the trio struck their trademark poses, declaring it a remarkable power indeed. In fact, they believed it was this very empathy that had led the elf to ask them to buy a pretty plant at the market, which they now placed in her hands. Maria had no idea, but her sister instantly recognized it as popple, an herb that induced overwhelming euphoria and hallucinations so dangerous it had been banned from consumption and cultivation in several countries. The moment Maria heard that, she tossed the plant away. Caria suspected that, judging from its pristine condition, it had likely been cultivated, especially since it was openly sold in Dragonton's markets. A shame, really, considering how hard Miss Antic worked to keep the city safe. Faced with such a delicate matter, the girls' bodyguards resolved to heighten their vigilance against whatever trouble might surface in this fragile region. Later, the Elfuer sisters were led to the Dragon Vein mine. The plan, of course, had been to conceal those cold yet breathtaking veins beneath the earth, but not all of them could be hidden. As the girls laid eyes on the glittering minerals, they were reminded of their mother's words that the world was brimming with wonders they had yet to see. The thought filled them with joy, and, at the same time, a tender longing for the woman who had raised them with such care. But not everything was so bright. Watching the sisters' movements, a merchant approached, introducing himself as Vesta Kirklane, an ambitious trader with a controversial proposal. Since Minegra was jointly controlling Dragonton in the midst of the war, he suggested that this foreign nation cultivate popple with him and share the profit. Of course, he had other enticing offers as well, but those required a more appropriate setting. Thus, he invited the sisters to join him later that very evening, at sunset, in a meeting place described on the parchment he handed them. As Caria accepted it, Vesta emphasized how much he enjoyed dealing with those aligned with darkness, for they understood his ideas quickly. He was certain, in fact, that Minegra's king would be thrilled by their conversation, and so he awaited the sisters at the meeting to come. Not long after, the Elfuer sisters were received once again in Dragonton's mayoral office. The impression was that their earlier outing had gone well. Indeed, the sisters even pledged to make themselves available should the mayor need assistance. On that note, Antic said that if they truly wished to help, she would appreciate them speaking well of her to the king of Minagra. They agreed without a second thought. Suddenly, Vesta barged into the office, flanked by two thugs, having gained entry through less than peaceful means. Since Caria and Maria had failed to appear at the meeting, the merchant had taken the liberty of showing up in person to hear their answer. Antic was stunned. She loathed Vesta and his schemes, and it almost sounded as though the elf sisters had gone behind her back to bargain with him. But Caria was quick to make things clear. She would never work with a man like him. Their absence from the meeting, she said, should have made that perfectly obvious. Since this man posed such a threat to the city, the emissary of Minagra requested to deal with him personally, assuring Antic she wished to avoid straining relations between their two domains. Antic, more than willing, gave her blessing, her finger pointed straight at the intruders as she declared how long those vermin had been wreaking havoc in Dragonton. With that, Ikiro, Gyro, and Saburo stepped forward to face the merchant and his henchmen. Yet strangely, Vesta remained far too calm. From his pocket, he produced a vial containing a purple serum. Caria suspected it to be a concentrated extract of popple. 1 dose of it, and you would never be able to live without it again. Before anything else, Caria asked if the man understood what he was doing, because in attacking emissaries, he was effectively declaring war on Minagra, the domain of the fearsome king of ruin. Vesta, however, brushed off any concern. With a single injection, the young ladies would obey his every command, and when that happened, Minagra's twisted ruler would surely do whatever it took to reclaim his beloved children. Confident in his scheme, Vesta handed the vial to one of his men and walked out, certain his plan was flawless. Yet the instant he stepped beyond the office doors, as his subordinate struck, the sword of one was flung aside, flying so close it nearly pierced the merchant's skull. Turning back in shock, he realized nothing had gone according to plan. Meanwhile, in Minagra, Takuto sat enjoying tea with his loyal companion. He marveled at how useful these units he had created were proving to be in this world, and Atu agreed wholeheartedly. Soon after, Emily arrived, curious as to why the kingdom had dispatched doctors as bodyguards for the emissaries when warriors might have sufficed. To this, Lamacenta explained that those combat doctors loved humans, half humans, too so much that they had developed unique abilities. In truth, they were known as brain eaters, as skilled in healing as they were in killing. Should it come to that, though they adored humans, they could never truly become one, and that unfulfilled desire had grown into a dangerous obsession. Back in the mayor's office, Vesta stood horrified at what had become of his men. The 3 brain eaters revealed their true nature, planning to strip the flesh from the dead so they might resemble humans even more closely. The merchant demanded to know what these creatures were. With unshakable conviction, they answered, "We are human." Just like the merchant, even Antic could not stomach the sight. She collapsed to the floor, overwhelmed by despair in the face of such a grotesque horror. Maria gently strokes the mayor's head, trying to console her, while Caria orders her subordinates to finish it quickly. Vesta argues that the elf shares his same alignment, as if that alone were reason enough for him to be spared. But the girl makes it clear that the two are not in the same position. What's more, Vesta showed open contempt for Minagra's beloved ruler, a crime that could never be tolerated. By declaring himself an enemy of the nation, he must now be eliminated as one. Finally, just as Takuto had once told her and her sister, Caria recalls that evil people are free, that is their nature. And so, with the king's approval, she chooses to exercise that freedom by putting an end to this opponent. Near death, the merchant begs for his life, but the elf coldly commands the mind-eaters to live up to their name. After the massacre, the healers drape themselves in the skins of the fallen men, feeling more human than ever. Caria apologizes for leaving the mayor's office drenched in blood, then politely asks if she can cover the cost of the cleanup by relieving her guests of this debt. And seeing Caria's pure and simple joy at the gesture, Antic cannot believe this little girl can remain so carefree in the middle of something so grotesque. The unease that comes with that realization terrifies the poor mayor so much that she ends up wetting herself on the spot. Noticing the awkward scene, the mind-eaters promise to urinate as well, so that their ally would not have to suffer such humiliation alone. But Caria dives at the 3 with a flying kick, stopping them before they can commit such an atrocity. And so, after witnessing one insanity after another, Antic begins to understand that her days of peace are still far from returning, even with Minagra's help. Check out these videos appearing on your screen and subscribe so you don't miss the next part.